Tricky fight coming up this weekend in the featherweight division. We have a couple of the biggest guys you're going to find at 145 in Omar, Venezuelan Fighter Morales, who's taking on, and it seems a little sacrilegious, but not GSP, it's JSP, Jonathan Pearce. And Matt, we have kind of a tale of two opposites, but they've kind of come together and mixed their fighting prides to make this fight. And that's why I say that this one's really tricky off the hop, because for me, when we're trying to whittle down the fight in the night screen at the start, there's a few outliers where we go, but that probably won't be it, but it might be. It could be a fun fight. And this is one of those ones because for Omar Morales, a classically trained striker, this is a guy whose father back in Venezuela owned a karate studio and then came up with his own version of martial arts called Slam. Now, I don't know if you read the magazine in the early to mid 2000s, but Slam magazine was a giant deal. LeBron James was on there. Omar Morales' father.
It still is.
It still is, but Omar Morales' father, different thing. But when you watch Omar fight, you can definitely see some differences in the way that he strikes, and he can really get it done in a lot of different ways, but he very much is a pressure fighter. And the reason why I say these guys have picked up some tricks of the trade and some fun is the fact that if you go back and watch Morales' last fight where he takes on a bodied up, hulking version of Shane Young, Omar really fought a complete game plan in that one.
He did, and that's the thing about Omar Morales. He is a very cerebral fighter when he's in there, and that's something that you always kind of pick up on. He does like to pressure his opponents quite a bit, but it's really odd. Normally when we think about pressure fighters, we always associate volume with that pressure. Omar is kind of unique where he is pressuring you a lot, but he's not somebody who's just going to be throwing 7-8 punch combinations at you. He will kind of wait behind the jab, try to set up his power shots, but the odd thing about Morales is that he's not the most heavy-handed striker in the world. He can get it done with one shot here and there, but he is somebody who relies a lot more on setting up their combinations, and that's the really cool thing about his version of karate. I'm just going to call it striking because he doesn't really fight like a traditional karate fighter would. We do think of like a Wonderboy Thompson, someone who stands sideways. He is more squared up to his opponent, more of like a kind of a boxing stance almost, but the thing about Omar is that he does really like to go in there hard with that calf kick. He can himself be susceptible to it. We've seen that in some of his fights. But hey, when you're fighting guys like Giga Chikadze, they're going to kick your calf, and it's not the end of the world if you don't check all of them. This should be a really interesting fight because I'm guilty of this, and I can openly admit this all the time. In life, you shouldn't let your losses define you. And that's just for anybody. I don't care what job it is.
Before you say this,
yes,
we got to break the fourth wall. There is a giant cloud of match judgment over Jonathan Pearce because of this.
And that's why I'm admitting it right up front. He got finished and looked awful by Joe Lozon, who again was so far past the hill he couldn't see it anymore. It's just one of those losses where in the moment it's like, wow, that really happened? And it did. And then if you look at Pearce at his next rebound fight against Kai Kamaka III, he looked much better and he looked like a much more improved version. So even I might have to chalk up his first loss to just octagon jitters or being in there with a guy who had a lot more experience than he himself.
So what I did too, because that loss, it kind of clouds my judgment of Jonathan Pearce too. So I went and did a deep dive of his entire career and his background even coming into martial arts. So I threw this one down here. In an interview that he did with Odds Checker just a couple of weeks ago from Canada's own James Lynch, had a couple of different things. He knew about this fighter. He's known about it for 6 or 7 weeks. Full camp for him. Obviously, you assume Omar Morales got a full camp too. But the really nice thing that he kind of touched on, and then I wanted to add to, he was a state runner-up at Science Hill High School in wrestling. So you know he has that wrestling in his back pocket. But the real kicker of a quotable was, I've never seen a striker out-wrestle a wrestler. I'm sure it's happened before, Jonathan. I'm sure it has, but that was what he was going with. Maybe a little bit of wordplay in the fact that he's going to wrestle with Omar Morales. Some guys have found success. Omar's only lost once. It was to a pure striker in Giga Chikadze where he got out-volumed, which is sometimes and normally his game. And it surprised me, I remember, even going into that fight. Why is Omar moving down a weight class? Because here's the thing. This guy is 3 weeks shy of his 36th birthday. He moved down to featherweight at a very advanced age, but that's where it gets even more interesting. With Omar Morales, you look at his overall activity. I'm going to throw this one out yet. There, these are all numbers. 1 fight in 2011, 2 fights in 2012, 1 in 2014, 1 in 2015, 1 in 2016, 1 in 2018, 2 in 2019, 2 in 2020, 1 in 2021. Not a lot of miles on the clock of Omar Morales. For him, he's coming out of Sanford MMA, training with the Burns brothers, Michael Chandler. You have some big fighters out of Sanford up near the top of this card. Of course, for Jonathan Pearce, he's coming out of one of the bigger I wouldn't say up-and-coming gyms because they've been there, but fight ready with Eddie Chow, with Santino DeFranco, so many great training partners over there as well. For Pearce, he's continued to get better at his striking. Again, you saw that in the Kai Kamaka fight, but again, for Pearce to out-wrestle a good wrestler in Kamaka, and I get it, Kamaka's lost a lot in the UFC. So what? He's still a good wrestler when it comes down to the fundamentals. For Pearce to impose his will, to use his physicality, to use a little bit of his boxing, that's what I think makes this a great fight. Because Morales is a primary striker who's gotten better at wrestling and did really well against Shane Young in that respect. For Jonathan Pearce, he's a good wrestler, but he continues to get better at his striking. Now, Joe Lozon tagged him in those boxing exchanges, but that fight wasn't yesterday. That fight, if we're being honest, was almost 2 years ago. But he's still gotten better. He's supposed to take on Gabriel Benitez earlier this year. Benitez weighed 150.5. Pearce said no. So now we get this fight months later. Overall, what's the takeaway here?
This should be a really fun fight, and I do have high hopes for it, but I don't think a win over Kai Kamaka III means that you can then go and beat a guy like Omar Morales. Because for Omar, we've only seen the one blemish, and that was against Giga Chikadze, and even in his other appearances. Like, he beat Gabriel Benitez and looked pretty good in that fight, and he was sound defensively, too. That's the other thing about Omar. He's not one of these fighters who gives up defensively in pursuit of more offense. He is somebody who will stay shelled up. He doesn't overexert himself a lot, and that's why I do feel like we're going to see a more fresh version of him, and that's why I think he should be able to get a decision win. I'm not going to say anything crazy. I don't think he's going to get a finish over Jonathan Pearce, but I do think this will be a well-matched up fight with Morales getting the win.
If you look at the odds for this one, Morales opened a minus 190 favorite. He's a minus 152 right now. For Jonathan Pearce coming back, he opened a plus 165. He's at a plus 126, again, over on Best Fight odds. If we have a look at Tapology, Matt, I haven't looked at the votes, so it's a surprise to us that it is to you. Holy smokes. 893 total votes, 86% Morales, 84% by decision. For the 14% that had Pearce, 46% by decision, 36% by knockout. I actually do think, again, if Pearce is able to go in there and fight his fight, he has a great opportunity at a win, and especially by finish. He trains with great strikers, too, in this division. Korean Zombie's one of his training partners. And for Morales, again, I've already talked about that Sanford connection. I had a little bit of a tricky fight here. For Pearce, too, the one thing I wanted to say, he had one fight in his career at bantamweight, 5 at featherweight, 6 at lightweight, 1 at 140, 1 at 145. So, again, weight really hasn't been his issue. But that just goes to the fact that he's fought everywhere, and he's huge. He's 6 feet tall in this division. You don't see that very often. I like Omar Morales because of the pressure, because of how he can get reserved in the storm, where Pearce is one of those guys that when he boxes, he just goes and goes and goes, and those firefights are great. Against Lozon, it wasn't good. Well, Kai Kamaka, you can kind of draw it out of him a little bit and then get into those wrestling exchanges, even like when Kamaka fought Tony Kelly. But for Morales, I like him in those exchanges because he can kind of wait, pick a shot, and then move forward. I like Morales in this fight, but I see this one as being very tight, and again, those odds are just narrowing even closer.
I just don't know where all this Kai Kamaka hype's coming from. It feels like when people beat him, then it's like, oh, now you're ready for a top 15 guy. Not really. Like, you even brought it up. We talked about Kai Kamaka as a wrestler, but he got out-wrestled by what? The assistant wrestling coach to the high school of wherever. Like, Jonathan Pearce isn't some guy who wrestled for Penn State for 4 years. He is a good...
Science Hill High School.
Exactly. He went to Science Hill High School. He doesn't have some crazy collegiate background. Like Curtis Blades, for instance. Curtis Blades went to a junior college, which people scoff at that, but still, at least he took some other route past...
Nick Maximov on this card as well was a JUCO national champion.
There you go, exactly. That means a lot more to me than you being the runner-up in your own state in high school. Those are credentials, but they are not weighted nearly as heavily as some of the wrestling credentials we will talk about with some of our fighters further on up the card. I still like Omar Morales in this fight. But this is much better than the opening fights that we have been getting for a lot of cards recently, I will say.
Matt's looking forward to this pay-per-view. Both of us going with Venezuela's own Omar Morales. Let us know down below in the comments section who you're taking in this fight. 2 title fights up at the top. Murphy taking on Shevchenko. Then you have Ortega challenging Volkanovski. You're not going to want to miss. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say. Let's get into it.